They don't write songs about the worst kind of evil, the kind that hides behind money and power. Not out here in the desert. Not under this hot sun. Out here, evil is quiet, like death itself. When something bad happens, it doesn't make noise. It just shows up without warning and waits for someone foolish enough to let it in. That morning, Jake Morgan let it in. It was a hot, heavy morning in Tombstone, Arizona. Jake walked outside with his coffee. The old wooden boards creaked under his boots. The land was quiet in every direction, no wind at all. He had come out to check on his animals. But what he saw wasn't a lost cow. It was a small, old wagon sitting by his fence. No driver, no wheel tracks in the dirt, just dust and heat. A mule stood tied to a post, chewing on nothing, like it had been waiting too long. In the back of the wagon, under old, torn cloth, was something. Or someone. There was a note tied to the rope, paid in full. Property delivered. Jake squinted his eyes. He hadn't ordered anything. And even if he had, no man sends something without giving a name or knocking on the door. He walked closer. The smell hit him first, sweat, blood, old fear. He pulled the cloth back slowly. There she was. A young woman, maybe in her early 20s. Dirty, beaten up, breathing like her lungs weren't sure they wanted to keep working. Her hands were tied. Her lips were cracked and dry. On her back, he could barely see deep, angry scars. Her eyes opened. She looked at him like someone who had already died once. She whispered, "You paid for me. Now finish it." Jake didn't speak. He didn't ask questions. He didn't even blink. He just stared. Because the truth is, some men fight in wars and think they've seen hell. But hell isn't a battlefield. Hell is a human being dropped at your door, cut up and left to die, while somebody out there thinks they've done you a favor. He untied her hands, carried her inside, and set her down gently in the back room. For the first time in years, Jake Morgan didn't know what to do next. But if you think this is just a story about a girl left at a stranger's door, you haven't seen what she's carrying with her. Rose didn't talk much the first few days. She slept like someone afraid to close her eyes too long. Jake didn't push her. He'd been around silence enough to know it had its own way of working. Some men ask too many questions. He wasn't one of them. Instead, he kept her warm and left food where she could reach it. Fresh water and a tin cup by the bed. He never crossed the room unless she was asleep or needed help. That kind of quiet takes patience and maybe a little guilt, too. He'd seen those scars again when he changed her bandages. The way they curved down her back, deep and careful. It wasn't random. Somebody had taken their time with her, like they were trying to write something. Jake didn't ask, but he saw how her shoulders got tight every time she heard boots on wood. On the third night, she sat up without his help. Didn't say a word, just stared into the fire like she was waiting for it to talk back. Jake sat nearby, drinking his coffee. After a while, she said it soft and tired, "You didn't touch me." He looked up and just nodded. Most men would have. Jake threw another log into the fire. His voice was low, like he was talking to himself more than her. "I ain't most men." That was it. No long speeches, no sweet words, just that. Over the next week, she started helping around the place. She brushed the horses and cleaned up dishes without being asked. One morning, Jake heard her humming. Not a song he knew, but it was a sound. A real sound from someone who had been nothing but quiet. In that moment, he realized something. This wasn't just about feeding a hurt stranger. It was about watching a soul climb back up from the edge of a hole nobody could see but her. By the second week, the silence broke. It wasn't over dinner and it wasn't in the daylight. It came late when the fire burned low and the wild dogs had gone quiet. Eliza's voice was barely a whisper, but it hit like a bullet. She told Caleb what had happened. Not all of it, just enough. Enough to make his jaw get tight. She had worked in the big house of a county official. She cleaned clothes, worked long hours, but it was decent enough at first. Then came his gambling and his debts. When he couldn't pay, he used her like a poker chip, a bet he could afford to lose. One night, she was dragged out, tied up, and burned by the very men who should have been keeping the peace. That scar on her back wasn't random. It was a word carved with a knife: worthless. Caleb didn't answer. He just stared at the fire. But inside, something boiled. He'd fought in wars, seen men killed and left in the dirt, but nothing stuck like this. This wasn't war. This was cowardice, and it was happening under the flag he once bled for. Eliza looked at him then, waiting for him to say something, anything. But he didn't. He only stood up, walked outside, and when he came back, there was ink on his fingers and a letter on the table. A letter to an old army friend in Tucson who now had some power in the fort. Caleb didn't need guns or fists. He needed proof. And Eliza's scars were proof enough. For the first time, she saw a bit of hope. Not a smile, not laughter, but the simple fact that someone believed her pain was worth writing down. That was a start. A week later, the desert brought them a visitor. Not the kind that knocks politely. This one rode in close to sunset, dust rising behind his horse, hat pulled low. The kind of man you know to keep your eyes on. Caleb saw him from the porch. Before the man even got off his horse, Caleb felt that old tension crawl back into his chest. Trouble had a way of showing itself without saying a word. The man called out like he owned the place, asking if the delivery had been received. He didn't use her name. He didn't even call her a woman, just the delivery. That was enough to make Caleb's jaw tighten. The man stepped down, boots hitting dirt hard. His eyes looked toward the cabin window. Eliza was inside, watching through the cracks, breathing hard, shoulders shaking. Caleb offered no welcome. He just stood there in that quiet way he had, waiting for the stranger to make his move. And he did. The man said he was here to collect what wasn't his to begin with. He stepped toward the door. That was when Caleb moved. No shouting, no show, just a quick step forward, his fist on the man's shirt, the other hand pressing cold steel under his chin. The fight didn't last long. It didn't need to. Caleb wasn't looking to kill, only to end it quick. Within moments, the man was on the floor of the cabin, hands tied with rope, cloth shoved in his mouth. Eliza didn't cheer or smile. She just sat in the corner, watching in disbelief as someone finally stood between her and the men who treated her life like a coin to be tossed. Caleb dragged the stranger outside, tied him to the post, and waited for dawn. The desert has a way of punishing pride. Men come thinking they can take what they want, but out here the land and the silence always collect what's owed. He knew soldiers from Tucson would be passing through soon. They would get their proof, flesh and blood this time, not just a letter. When dawn came, the soldiers from Tucson rode in, dust cloud trailing behind them. Caleb handed over the man tied to the post along with the letter he'd written days before. They took him without question, the weight of his guilt written all over his face. Eliza stood in the doorway, watching as the horseman disappeared into the distance. For the first time, she realized the fight was no longer hers alone to carry. Somebody had stood with her, and the world had finally listened. The days that followed were different. There was no more waiting for boots at the door or shadows on the porch. She cooked. She worked the land. She even laughed once or twice, surprising herself as much as Caleb. He didn't say much, just went about his work. But the silence between them was no longer heavy. It was a kind of peace. One evening, she sat by the fire, the same place she had once whispered that broken plea. She told Caleb she wanted to stay. Not because she had nowhere else to go, but because this was the first place that had given her a choice. Caleb didn't reply right away. He just nodded slow. The kind of nod that meant more than a dozen words. Out on that ranch, miles away from the noise of politics and greed, two people learned that healing doesn't always come in thunder or blood. Sometimes it comes quiet. In the sound of water boiling on the stove. In a scar that doesn't hurt as much. In a man who chooses to listen instead of demand. Maybe that's what we forget too often. That sometimes the greatest strength is not in drawing a gun, but in choosing kindness when the world expects cruelty. And maybe the scars we carry, no matter how deep, are not the end of our story, but proof we kept walking. In the end, the West was never just about land and guns. It was about people, how broken and how brave they could be.